Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank all the organizations that co-sponsored this visit. I have had a long day of meetings, starting from 8 a.m. with all of the constituents and stakeholders in Denver Public Schools and related to them. And they also thank the School of Social Work for hosting us this evening, the Dean, for providing those nice, healthy snacks in the back there. And all of you coming out despite the rain and the lightning out there. So it's great to be here in Denver. Not my first trip to the area by any means. I feel as though I come here pretty often. And I'm glad to see the focus on this issue. I would even be happier if I could say this is a region that's definitely making clear progress. And tell people this, you want to find out where they're making progress in addressing these disparities, come to the Denver metro area. And hopefully that'll be true in the not too distant future. Someone asked me today how I got into this work, and it is, I think as is often the case, very personal. And so let me give a little bit of that background. I was a student at Brown University. I was struggling with figuring out, a kind of existential moment, why I'm there, what do I really want to study. I thought I was going to be pre-med and then realized I hate chemistry. And and I forgot, if I talk too fast, I know there's translators, just tell me, slow it down. So I decided to take a course in educational psychology. And part of that course required us to go into schools as a kind of a practicum to learn about the work of schools. And I was asked to go work with a kindergarten teacher. And she said, I have 5 boys who are a lot of trouble. I'm going to give you them an hour. For an hour, you have them. They're yours. Right? And 3 times a week was the plan that I would come in for an hour and spend. And I'm thinking, I'm 19. I'm totally untrained, but I'm wondering, how hard can that be? Right? They're 5 years old. They're so cute. Right? And so the first time I get there, it's clear they're a lot more restless and energetic than I had imagined, but I'm still not intimidated by 5-year-olds. So, and since I have the freedom to do whatever I want, which seems like a strange scenario to me, I decided the next time to come with a football. And so for the next 30 minutes, I play football with these little boys, and they're loving it, and they're running up and down, and I have a very clear goal in mind, to get them tired. Because I figure if I get them tired, then I'm going to be able to get taught to talk to them and do some other things, and it works. And so after that very first experience at the age of 19, I learned, first of all, the goal is not to crush the children or to break their will, but to channel the energy constructively, right? Because children have energy, especially boys. My next experience was becoming a student teacher in the Providence Public Schools at Central High School. And I was just into it. I loved it. I loved the work, despite the fact that this was considered one of the failing schools in the district, and despite the fact that my mentor teacher pretty much just drank coffee and didn't mentor me. I still loved it. I thought there was amazing power in being a teacher. One day I was really frustrated with a student who was just a pain in the butt, and just harassing me, harassing other kids. And during the passing periods, I said to another teacher, I said, if I just could get rid of that one kid, my class would be fine. And the teacher said to me, that kid? His mother's boyfriend beats him up almost every day. And as soon as he said that to me, I totally changed the way I approached that student. And he became my assistant in the classroom. He was responsible for giving out the textbooks. And his whole behavior changed largely because of the way I saw him and treated him changed. And again, I realized, the goal is not to push them away, but to bring them in, right? Because it's through the engagement and their participation that the behavior changes. Right? And then last was my experience in Berkeley as chief of staff to the mayor of Berkeley. And I was chief of staff at the age of 26 during the crack cocaine years, when the crack cocaine had hit the city and just overwhelmed everyone. And we had drive-by shootings, and we had all kinds of crime rising in the city. And here I am on the front lines trying to figure out how to respond and what to do. Totally overwhelmed because I start to realize the police know where the crack is being sold, and really their strategy is one of containing it to certain areas, right? Not eliminating it by any means. And I'm frustrated. And one day, an administrator who worked in the public schools comes to see me. And he was a colleague, a friend of mine, and he had a reputation as someone who was an advocate for kids who were not well served. And he comes to see me, and because of his advocacy, he'd been punished by the superintendent and gone from being a senior administrator to be the principal of the alternative school, because she thought that would force him into retirement. He was already in his 60s. But instead of being moved to retire, he comes to me with one of his students and said, Pedro, I'd like you to convince this young man to run for student body president of my school. And I'm wondering why, because this young man doesn't look like presidential material to me, because he's got thick gold chains, gold teeth, beeper gold rings. I'm thinking anybody with that much gold is probably doing something else. And why would you want him to be the president? But after a few minutes of talking to the young man, I start to realize this young man is extremely intelligent. He's a natural leader. He's going to run the school either way. And the principal is wise enough to realize he needs this young man on his side, not against him. And so I say to my friend, George Perry, I said, I'd like to learn more about your school. I know we had what they call a continuation school in Berkeley. He said, well, please come, I need help. So I show up the next day, and in a community that was one of the first in the country to voluntarily integrate its schools, I find a school that's totally segregated. This is a school that's essentially a dumping ground for kids that they don't believe can be served. And it doesn't function like a school at all. There's far more kids in their cars smoking not just cigarettes, hardly anybody in the classroom. I walk around, talk to teachers, what's it like to work here? One teacher tells me, it's fine, no problem. We don't bother them, they don't bother us. Everybody gets along. So I go back to my friend George Perry and I say, look, George, you got a big problem in your hands. This school. He says, well, really, there's only two problems. I said, what's that? He said, the teachers and the kids, that's it. And I said, well, you're right about that, but those are big ones. He said, well, I know how to work with the teachers. He said, the kids are the ones that I don't know how to address. I got to figure out a way to get them from the parking lot back into the classroom. So he said, can you help me with that? I said, well, I could do something that I think is worth a try. I can go talk to the kids. Right? What a radical idea, talk to the kids. And so the first thing I learned is that all of these kids are old enough to quit if they want to. Right? You have to be at least 16 to be assigned to this school. They're coming to school, they're not going to class for the most part, they're not doing the work, but they're coming to school because they haven't given up on themselves yet. They still want a degree, right? Because they think that's important. And then from talking to them, I start to realize the overriding concern for these young people is their survival. Right? Because many of them are really grappling with very tough issues about how to support themselves, support their families, and some of them were definitely involved in illegal activity. So I go back to my friend George and said, George, if you want to get these kids back in the classroom, first of all, you got to teach them something. And second of all, you got to show them it's possible to earn a living and do school. He said, well, I don't know how to do that. Well, I'd been the chief of staff to the mayor, and I knew there was a biotech firm in Berkeley that was negotiating with the city for the right to expand operations. Bayer Laboratories, they produce Bayer aspirin, among other things. And I'd been involved in those negotiations, so I went directly to the CEO. I said, why don't you build and develop a biotech academy at our school? And because it's a German firm, and in Germany they use apprenticeships as a strategy for getting young people into technical fields, he said, well, this makes so much more sense than anything the city's asked for, because we have trouble getting trained employees, even for entry-level jobs. An entry-level job in biotech paid $15 an hour in 1988. So we spent the next few years developing this biotech academy. It took us 4 years to turn what was a dumping ground for bad kids into a genuine alternative. That school is now part of a consortium of schools that works with 7 other high schools, 2 community colleges, 1 4-year school, and 5 biotech firms. It's now 22 years old. And expanding opportunities for kids. I start with these stories because addressing racial disparities in education, which while so important to our work of creating schools that serve all children well, is really about figuring out how to engage kids. Right? It's about how to show them that by investing in their education, that they can actually make their lives better. It's not simply about changing the rules. I'm concerned because right now, since the Justice Department issued its report about the importance of doing something about these disparities, which I think was very important, I'm going to give the Attorney General, who's about to leave, a lot of credit for that, and particularly for acknowledging as a civil rights issue. Right? But what concerns me is that some districts, because they don't like the way their data looks, will simply say, don't suspend kids. And I would say that's not the solution. Because schools absolutely have to be safe and orderly environments for anybody to teach and learn in. So we're going to have to do more than simply stop suspending. We're actually going to have to figure out how do we create schools where kids want to be there, where teaching is really an activity that the teachers are inspired by and feel supported in. And unless that's the work, what the work looks like, we're not going to see these disparities, whether we talk about disparities in achievement or disparities in discipline, reduced. And so I want to spend the next several minutes talking to you about how to get there. And I started out by saying, yep, you've got to have these disparities addressed. We've got to recognize that the disparities in achievement mirror the disparities in discipline. And part of the reason why they mirror them is because in most schools, we disproportionately punish the kids with the greatest needs. And more often than not, we punish them because of their needs. That sounds cruel when I say it like that, doesn't it? But I saw it over and over again. When I was I was an elected member of the school board in Berkeley, California, we did the expulsion hearings. Who did we expel? Kids in group home, foster care, homeless kids, kids with learning disabilities. In every case, they had done something terrible. And in every case, the signs of trouble appeared far earlier, and nothing was done to address the problem. I had a group of girls once that were beating up other girls. They called themselves the BBA. Forgive me, the children in the room, but it stood for baddest bees around. And they were beating up other girls. Because they said they were going to beat up girls they thought looked cute. So when I read this case, I said, well, this is going to be an expulsion I'll feel good about for a change, because these girls are mean. Until I start reading about the backgrounds of these girls. And every single one, group home, foster home, no families. Now, I cite as an example because I would say that we definitely don't want kids beating up other kids, and we don't want, as I already said, we need an orderly environment, but we've got to recognize that for many kids in this country right now, our public schools are all that remains of the social safety net. It's the one institution that serves all of the children. Right? And so there might be other institutions that turn their back, but they still have a right to go to school. And so we have to make sure that as a community, we are providing schools with the resources to meet and address those other needs. I have seen, and I know the educators in the room will attest to it, kids who can't read who act out at reading time. Sending them home to suspend them is not going to serve them unless there's a reading tutor waiting. We not only disproportionately punish kids with the greatest needs, we do it in the most senseless way imaginable. As if watching TV and playing video games would change your behavior. But across the country, that's what we do in the name of discipline. And in many schools, we keep punishing the same kids over and over again because we're concerned about safety, and we should be concerned about safety, particularly since the school shootings occurred. And one of the most extreme examples occurred not far from here. But what's ironic about those school shootings, which gave birth and advent to these zero tolerance policies is that most of those shootings occurred in suburban communities. But the most punitive discipline is being carried out right now in urban areas for the most part. And in the name of discipline and safety, we're seeing schools converted into prison-like facilities, where there are metal detectors and security guards and surveillance cameras. And I absolutely, as I said already, believe schools must be safe. And sometimes I think metal detectors are necessary. I've come to realize that, yep, when sometimes there are weapons on the school, kids will bring weapons in. But let's be clear about this. A metal detector is only a symbol. If you really want to bring a weapon into school, you don't have to go through the front door. There are lots of other ways to bring a weapon in. If people can bring weapons into prisons and drugs, guess what? They can do all kinds of things in schools too. So our strategy can't simply be to turn our schools into prisons, which is the path we've been on. It has to be a different approach. And I think that approach has to start by acknowledging that in order to create safe school, we've got to look at the conditions in schools. We've known for a long time that anonymity contributes to behavior problems in schools. Kids behave differently when they're known. When the adults there not only know them, but know something about them, know how to reach their mother, for example. Know what their interests are. That is, when we start to create schools that are function as a sense and provide kids with a sense of community, safety goes up. And the reason why it goes up is because our safest schools, the schools that typically have the fewest behavior problems, are always places where there are strong relationships. James Coleman wrote about this and described this as social closure, right? Where there are these strong relationships between adults and children, not just the adults who work there, but their parents as well. Because when these relationships are strong, students get the support they need, and students are more likely to turn to an adult when they're faced with a problem that they can't handle on their own. And so rather than turning our schools into prisons, I think we've got to focus on something altogether different. One of the biggest shortages in our schools today is the shortage of adults with moral authority. Durkheim called moral authority this very important trait, this attribute that was rooted not in your title, but in the relationships you had with the community. Some schools I go to, the person with moral authority is the woman in the lunchroom. I worked at a school in Oakland where they decided, when they had an opening for a security guard, middle school, rather than hiring another large man, because usually the criteria to be a security guard in middle school is that you have to be big, right? So you can physically intimidate the children, they decided to hire a 63-year-old grandmother. And I asked them about that decision. They said, well, we'd seen her in action. She can discipline the adults too, right? Why? Because she has that very nebulous quality of moral authority. She represents something the kids respect and know they must respect. I saw her tell a girl, she said, I knew you before you were born, as a way to remind her who she was. And so when we have a shortage of these kinds of adults, our schools actually become less safe. We start to think that we can rely on guards and metal detectors, and guess what? We'll never have enough guards or metal detectors to make our schools safe. And so we've got to focus more on how to build these kinds of relationships in schools that are conducive to learning and conducive to children receiving the kinds of support they need. So I ask you now, if you're in a school, to reflect on who are we disciplining in schools? What's the profile look like? What are the needs that they're bringing that may not be getting addressed? What strategies are we using? Let me ask this. If you were thinking about your own children, how many of you would tell your own children if they were acting out to go away for a few days and come back when you'll be ready to behave? Right? That's just insane, right? But that's how we treat our children. People talk about a school to prison pipeline. Well, that pipeline is built by unsupervised children in the street who've been sent out of school and now are primed for delinquency. I was visiting a school like that in Berkeley, California, given a tour by the assistant principal. very proud of all the renovations in the building and showing me around, takes me to the library, takes me to see the computer lab. We get to his office and there's a little boy about this tall waiting for him. He turns to me, he says, "You see that kid?" He said, "There's a prison cell in San Quentin waiting for that boy right now." So I said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "Well, I can tell by the way he behaves. He's out of control, he's rude, he's disrespectful. His father's in prison, his brother's in prison. So it's just a matter of time before he ends up there too." So then I turned to him and I said, "Well, given what you know about this boy, what is the school doing to keep him out of prison?" And he looks at me like he's surprised, like he doesn't think that's his job. In fact, what he was about to do was to take this boy and assign him to long-term suspension with his sick grandmother, where they would send the work home and then effectively wash their hands. Now, what you should know is that assistant principal was an African-American man, and the boy was an African-American boy. This is not simply about getting the racist out of our schools, because he actually thought he was doing his job very well. But the way we've defined these jobs are not about keeping kids in, it's been about pushing them out. And so we've got to reflect on how much of that approach has been built into the way we think things should be done to keep schools safe and orderly. We rarely ask whether or not what we're doing is working. Right? Even though I go to schools where they're suspending some of the kids over and over again, the same kids. After a while, you'd have to say, well, clearly this is not working. I was at a school in Cleveland, Ohio, talking to the principal. Boy comes in, and he says, principal says, "You've been cutting, haven't you?" He says, "Yes, I have." He says, "Well, you're going to get suspended 3 days." Boy says, "Give me 5 days this time. I want 5. He says, "Okay, smart aleck, you get 5 days." So I'm sitting watching. Boy leaves. I say, "Do you really think this is going to work?" He says, "Well, it's not going to change the cutting, but it's going to get him out of my hair for 5 days." I would say that we're using discipline now to get rid of the kids we don't want to serve. Lawrence Kohlberg, a psychologist writing about moral development in the 1970s, says the goal of discipline is not to teach kids to avoid punishment. It is to teach kids to do what is right, even when we're not looking. Think about, if that were really the goal, what would be different about discipline practices in schools? I go to so many schools that have all kinds of rules, right? Up about what you can and can't do, rules against headphones, rules against cell phones, rules against different attire. I rarely go to schools that explicitly teach values like respect and kindness and empathy and honesty and integrity. And I would say if those values are not explicitly taught and totally embedded in the curriculum and modeled by the adults who work there, very hard to create truly civil, ethical communities, which is what we should be after. We have a fixation on the rules, but we don't have a fixation on how to build character. And I would say that that absence, that tendency to ignore these larger issues contributes to discipline policies that simply don't work and don't produce change. We see too much emphasis on exclusion and humiliation. Most schools start with humiliation, work their way to exclusion. Too much emphasis on locating the problem in the child and ignoring the way in which the environment may in fact be contributing to the behavior. It's not to say there aren't some children out there with serious needs and issues. There are. And there are many schools that don't have the resources, the expertise to meet their needs. I was meeting with a group of principals in New York City, schools with very high superintendent suspension rates. The principal of one of the schools said, "We suspend because we lack other tools." And someone said, "Can you elaborate on that?" He said, "Well, I had a student who just enrolled in my school. He had recently been released from Rikers Island. Rikers Island, if you don't know, is the second largest penal institution in the world. He shows up without a parent to enroll in school. Principal says, well, I'm going to meet him halfway. I'm going to take him. Seems like he's demonstrating some responsibility. That same day, within a few hours, the boy had been in 2 fights and punched a teacher. And then the principal discovered that he was bipolar and had no medication. Now, I would say a system, because New York City controls Rikers, and the Department of Education controls the schools at Rikers. They could have at least sent a note letting him know he's coming, right? Make sure he gets his meds. The systems have total breakdown. And because the systems have so many design flaws, we have kids falling right through the cracks. I was remarking on it today when we saw a man hit by a car in the street, just across the street from the district's office. The number of homeless people on our streets today, right, who are mentally ill, right, is an outrage. But not a lot of outrage voiced about it. Because in effect, once we closed the mental hospitals, we turned our prisons into mental institutions. Right? Rikers Island, over 30% of the people incarcerated are mentally ill. And we are one of few countries that uses solitary confinement as a form of punishment on juveniles. So there's a lot that's wrong with what we're doing. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the rules that we've adopted in schools don't help kids to get re-engaged. One of the things we've known for a long time is kids who become discouraged, kids who are not successful, have very little incentive to behave. That's because school is based on a social contract, an unwritten contract between the student and the school. In exchange for an education, we expect that student to conform to the basic rules and norms. Which kids are least likely to conform? The kids who are not getting an education. If we don't find a way to re-engage them, to make sure that they understand why they're there, that in fact their learning needs are being met, we will continue to find large numbers of kids who are alienated and in many cases acting out. So we've got to get smarter at how we approach this. We've got to get more willing to design schools that can meet the needs of the kids rather than expecting the kids to adapt to the conditions in the schools. That's what we've done. And the kids who can't do it are the kids who slip through the cracks. And given how many of our kids, and I'm not just talking, I like to remind people that it's not just poor kids who are at risk. These school shootings, if anything else, should have shown us there are a whole lot of middle-class kids out there who are deeply alienated and very much at risk. Middle-class kids more likely to use drugs. Middle-class kids more likely to contemplate or attempt suicide. Middle-class kids, particularly girls, more likely to have eating disorders. Just depends on which risk we're focused on. But there are a lot of kids at risk out there. And we've got to figure out ways, since schools are often the places where we identify the children who are vulnerable, to provide the support so that we can begin to help more kids before their cries for assistance manifest themselves in something really dangerous. So this means moving away from a reactive approach, which I characterize as going on in most of our schools today, to a preventative approach. The reactive approach relies heavily on exclusion and ostracism as a way to deal with behavior. It relies on, engages parents after a problem, right? Not before. And the reactive approach focuses a lot on behavior infractions while ignoring the issues behind the behavior. We focus on the symptoms, not the causes. We've got to focus and address the causes. And if we address the causes, we would adopt a much more preventative strategy, where we were more explicitly focused on teaching values and reinforcing norms, building a culture for learning. We were building relationships between teachers and students, reinforcing the moral authority of teachers, where we would spend more time addressing the underlying causes of behavior problems and much more time getting kids proactively engaged. I work with a school right now in the Bronx, Mott Haven Prep, very tough neighborhood. Lots of their kids come in with great needs. They say any kid coming in with a criminal record into high school gets a mentor before they get in trouble. You already got in trouble. We're going to make sure this time there's someone that knows you on campus, there's someone who knows your family, who's connected to you, because they understand the power of relationships for transforming behavior. And it sounds trite, except that the data keeps showing us how powerful it is. We've known for years, for example, that kids who are involved in music, in sports, in theater, write for the newspaper, will do better in school and get in less trouble than kids who are not involved. You talk to the kids who are not involved, the kids who are frequently in trouble, and you find kids who are disconnected and alienated and have no adult support. And so that strategy, I would argue, is a lot actually cheaper than many of the things we invest on. We will, Richmond Public Schools in California, when they were going bankrupt, still install metal detectors. But no social workers. Had counseling ratios, counselor to student ratios of 5 and 600 in their high schools. Right? So who's spending time talking to the kids? Who knows the kids in that scenario? Those kinds of schools are ripe for trouble because the solution we pursued is a solution that doesn't enable us to get at the kids who are at greatest risk. So we need to really understand how to build these relationships in schools. And I always say that the hardest thing to teach a teacher is how to build relationships. You can teach a teacher the content, hopefully, in school, so they know the content well. The challenge then is to make sure they can teach it to our kids. You can give them instructional strategies so they can teach in a variety of ways. The hardest thing is to teach how do we build strong relationships, particularly across race and class differences, so that there's a sense of trust in the classroom. There are many kids, and a lot of research showing that many children of color are relational learners. They will work from teachers they know care about them, and they will choose not to work for teachers they think don't like them. We say, well, that might be self-sabotage, and yes, it is, but guess what? They're kids. And so figuring out how to help teachers become better at building these relationships is, I think, one of the central strategies we've got to rely upon. And the good news is those teachers are in our schools already. And if you want to find them, just ask the kids. They'll tell you. And repeatedly I've worked with schools, and the kids will tell me, I say, who are the best teachers? You know what? The best teachers are not the kids who are showing films all the time, right? Or letting them play. The best teachers are the one who actually challenge them, who push them, who expect them to be prepared. And they'll tell us who those teachers are. And what's striking to me is that those teachers almost always work in isolation from their peers. And so what they know, the expertise they've gained, is often not shared, not available to their peers. Even when we have peers who are brand new, fresh out of college. And in most districts, what do we do to them? We put them in the most challenging classrooms, right? As if that was a good idea. Show me the research to support that one. I know that I don't want to disparage Teach for America, because I think many of the young people who go into it do so for the best reasons. But I still think it's a bad idea to put our least experienced teachers in our most challenging classrooms. So I'm working with a middle school in Oakland, and a brand new teacher comes to me. She's Teach for America. She fits the profile. She's smart. She's idealistic, went to a good Ivy League school, and she's totally overwhelmed. And she says, I need help with classroom management. No one's been willing to help me. Can you help me? I say, sure, I'll come in and sit in your classroom. I sit in the classroom. After a few minutes, it's clear that it's far worse than she described. Because kids are screaming. There's chaos in the room. It's painful to sit through. At the end of the period, I go to talk to her, and she says, well, it's like this every day, and I can't take it. I'm about to quit. I leave every day with a migraine. I say, well, don't quit. Let's go talk to the principal. And together we talk to the principal, and she describes what's happening in her classroom. And the principal listens and then says, you're a professional, deal with it. And then I speak up. I said, listen, if you don't help her, she's going to quit. It's only March. You'll have to get a sub for the rest of the year. Well, that gets to him. He says, I don't want that. He says, I have an idea. There's a veteran teacher who's just retired. She's great with kids. I can call her back as a sub, but I can only afford 2 days. But I'm going to ask her to take over your classroom. I'm going to ask you to sit and watch her, because I think you can learn some things about teaching from watching this teacher. So both the new teacher and I think this is a good idea. Only idea we heard that sounds like it might work. So the next day, the veteran teacher shows up. She's an older woman. She's got a big coat, big bag. And you can tell some about the way she walks, the way she looks. The real thing is here. And the kids can tell too. And it actually has a calming effect on the classroom because she just proceeds to go right into the lesson. It's a math class. These are not her kids, though she's taught the school before. And the kids are on task, and the new teacher and I are shocked. We can't believe the same classroom. But at one point during her lesson, she sees two girls talking. So she stops what she's doing, and she turns to one of the girls. She says, "Young lady, when I'm speaking, I want you to be quiet." And then she goes back to go to write on the board, and the girl, under her breath, uses the B word. Okay? But it was way down here. Bitch, down there. You could pretend it was a sneeze or a burp or a fart or something else. You could let it slide if you wanted to. But she's not letting it slide. So she turns to the girl. She says, "Young lady, do I look like your mother?" And the whole class says, "Woo, you're bringing mother into it now." And the girl immediately says, "No, you don't look like my mother." She says, "Well, whenever you speak to me, I want you to think of your mother." And then she goes back to the lesson. Girl goes back to work. Class does not miss a beat. New teacher turns to me and says, "How did she know that that would work? Where did she get that technique from? Did she get that in grad school somewhere? Is there a handbook that says when they cuss at you, You know, I always say teaching is like the martial arts. Right? She was a black belt in teaching, okay? And you get the black belt not through seniority, right, but by mastering the craft. Right? She knew that she could not ignore the comment, because if she ignores it, all the other kids have heard it and they know you are not the real thing because you just let a kid curse at you. And so what happens now, this curse is coming out all over the room. She knows she can't get on the phone and call for help. "Send a dean, they're cursing at me." Right. One little curse and you need backup, that means you're definitely not the real thing. She doesn't take it personally. She doesn't escalate it. Instead, she tries to diffuse it. She wants to nip it in the bud. She says, "Speak to me the way you would speak to your mother." Now, what's also implied there is that even if you talk to your mother that way, you can't talk to me that way. And then what? And then back to work. Because she also knows that kids who are actually engaged in the work will be less disruptive. When people talk about classroom management, what's the best classroom management? Academic engagement is the best classroom management. Now, the new teacher saw that, and we spent a long time afterwards talking to the veteran teacher about her methods. And one of the things she came away with was a new appreciation for teaching, how complex it is, something that a lot of policymakers really don't get. Right? But she also came away realizing maybe I'm not cut out for this job, which would be a good thing, right? Because I think we make it far too easy for people to get in and far too difficult for some to get out. This is not easy work. It takes a lot of skill and emotional and social intelligence to be an effective teacher. And so when we see teachers who bring this all together, we need to make sure they're being used to mentor and to model for others how to do this very important work. Because they are in our schools. And unfortunately, too many of our teachers are isolated. So we've got to figure out, how do we start to create schools where the adults are learning, where the kids are learning, where we have a true sense of community. Because they said already, not only do the kids perform better and behave better when there's community, the teachers teach better. The teachers teach better because then they're collaborating, they're helping each other. I was at a school in Modesto, California, a high-performing, high-poverty school, Henshaw Middle School. Over 90% of the kids, recent immigrants from Mexico, been a blue ribbon school for years now. When I visited the school, I was struck by the fact that not only are parents involved, parents are supervising kids and activities on the playground. I asked the parents, "You get paid?" They said, "No. We love the school. We're happy to help." They had every kid, every 8th grader in algebra. Every 8th grader in algebra. And the kids who weren't ready for the rigorous algebra because their arithmetic skills were too weak got double period algebra. They didn't lower the bar, they just gave them more time and more support and really good teachers. After a while of touring the school, I said, I think they're just showing me the good things. I want to see a new teacher. You must have some new teachers. He said, okay, yeah, go down the hall, you can see a new teacher. So I sat in his class, and after a few minutes, it's clear he's new. He's kind of fumbling. He's kind of, not as smooth. And he comes to me during a break. He says, I guess you can see I'm new here. I'm still learning the ropes. I said, well, how's it going? He said, look, I feel like I can't fail here. I said, why not? He said, because I got so many people helping me. People are giving me curriculum. People are talking to me about my classes. I said, I would have to be an idiot to fail here. Read Dana Goldstein's new book, The Teacher Wars. I encourage you to read it. It's a bestseller right now. Teacher Wars, about the most embattled profession. One of the things she says, and she quotes Dewey in saying it, is that we always have drawn our ranks. People like to disparage teachers by saying we're not getting our best students into teaching. Well, guess what? A lot of the world doesn't get their best college students into teaching. Dewey reminds us we've always drawn our teachers from ordinary people. We've got to create schools where ordinary people can be highly effective. That's the work of education. You don't have to be a superhuman. You don't have to be a Nobel Prize winner to be a great teacher. And we've got to figure out ways to give teachers the support they need, because so much of this work of discipline starts at the classroom level. Starts at the classroom level. And so we've got to figure out how to adopt strategies in schools and build support systems for children and for teachers so that we can not only reduce the number of kids who are being pushed out. Suspension should be a last resort, not the only resort. But also that we're creating schools that are actually helping our communities. We should have schools that are assets to our communities. That's the way it should work. Should be right now in so many cities, anybody with money is not putting the kids in the public schools. They're doing everything they can to find ways to get away from the public schools. So who do our public schools serve? Our public schools serve the most disadvantaged population. And when you then staff that school with inexperienced teachers, that's a recipe for trouble. So we've got to find a way to build support in our communities for our schools. That was the strategy we used in Berkeley, where we got Bayer Laboratory to support the school. Who are your partners for your schools in Denver? Universities can be partners. Hospitals and clinics can be partners. Nonprofits, churches can be partners. We need to think holistically about the needs of our kids. Hunger is an issue in schools. Right now, throughout this country, it's a serious issue. I was talking to a group of principals in Michigan who were sending food home on Fridays with kids because they knew they may not eat on the weekend. Right? There are lots of families out there that are struggling, and the one place they know the kids will be fed is when they're at school. Which is the reason why I believe that even in our struggling public schools, we've got to embrace them rather than disparage them, even as we hold them accountable and demand more. So we need to think about discipline as a symptom of a sign of trouble, a sign that schools need more help than they're getting right now. And I want to again applaud you for coming to the table with all the right constituents, right? And analyzing the data and looking at what's going on. And I want to encourage you to do this without simply pointing fingers. It's so easy in these conversations to blame the parents, to blame the kids, to blame the teachers, to blame the district. And I would say when we're blaming people, we're not solving problems because we're not accepting responsibility for what the work is. So we got to make sure that we are doing more than merely casting blame. And that means having conversations about what we can do to alter these patterns and to create discipline strategies that are far more creative than the ones we use now. Ask kids, would you like to be sent up for 3 days, or would you rather come in on Saturday, right? Right, to make up for the work you didn't do, right? Punishment for not doing your work should be more work, not less work. Right? Punishment for being rude to a teacher should be a formal apology, and maybe you become the teacher's assistant now. That is, we need meaningful discipline, discipline that's focused on actually reinforcing the values that we know are so essential to becoming a responsible adult. and do much more than simply pushing kids out of school. So let me close with this. We have a lot of good research on policing that's worked, right? Boston was experiencing in the 1980s the highest juvenile homicide rate in the country. Right? That distinction has been taken over by Chicago. Right? And they solved it by doing proactive mentoring on kids on probation. They showed up on Friday nights and say, "Where are you? You're supposed to be at home." And it wasn't the probation officer, it was the local minister too. Right? And they found if they could just keep the kids who are most likely to kill each other at home, guess what happens? Homicides go down. Right? And so there's a lot about safety that we already know. We've known, the police have known for a long time. Community policing works. Works better than getting yourself a shotgun and a pit bull. Because when neighbors are looking out for each other, they'll let you know when the moving van pulls up and you're not home. Right? What does that mean for schools? It means building community where we are knowing our kids and where there's trust between students and kids is key to safety. The school in Massachusetts, in Fall River, Massachusetts, where a girl went to her teacher and told her, "Something bad is about to happen tomorrow. I advise you not to come to school. I like you, don't come." And the teacher thought this girl might be telling her something real, so she notified the police, and lo and behold, that girl was a part of a group that was ready to shoot up the school the next day. A relationship saved lives at the school. So relationships are not just something frivolous that we can just dismiss as being an extra because it's not measurable. No, they actually have measurable impact on the quality of the learning experience for kids. And we need to do more to build and invest in those. So my challenge to you here in Denver is, do you love your kids as much as you love your football team? Right? I know you love those Broncos, even after they lost in the Super Bowl, right? But do you love your children as much? Right? Are you willing to invest in them? Are you willing to build these support systems? Are you willing to create schools that you'd put your own children in? And if we're willing to do those things, not only will we see the disparities in discipline and achievement get reduced over time, we'll see schools that really do function as assets for this community. That's within our reach. That's something we can do if we've got the will and the commitment to make it happen. I hope you can make it happen here in Denver. Thank you. Thank you.